I was trained in science, brain science, and I've tracked theology, biblical theology. Each makes radical claims on reality. Science avers to be the only way to know the physical world. Theology avows to be the only way to know the spiritual world. For 50 years, these two ways of knowing, science and theology, have consumed me. I've sought their intersect. But some say the intersection is empty. There's nothing there. Science is real, theology is a myth. Others say that only by science and theology working together can one truly apprehend deep reality. Which is it? Science alone, or science and theology together? Can science and theology find deep reality? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and closer to truth is my journey to find out. Do I begin with a scientist or a theologian? I'll try both in the same person. A philosopher of science, a Roman Catholic priest trained in physics, Ernan McMullin. Ernan lives in Ireland, and we meet in Cambridge, England. Ernan, what do you think about the relationship of science to theology?
I think theology has a great deal to learn from science. Let me give one example in particular. One of the traditional views about the creation was that it was a sequential creation, that God did thus and so and thus and so and thus and so. Now, the implication of that is that at the beginning it needed more adjustment, basically, that more had to be done. Now, Augustine in the 5th century was thinking deeply about that because he was challenged on that very issue by his former co-religionists, the Manichaeans. And his answer was very radical in terms of his day, but it was widely accepted. And this comes as a surprise to us today, because what he had to say was that from the beginning, the possibilities of all the kinds of things that will come later, those possibilities are there from the beginning. There's not a sequence. And he goes on to say, and those kinds will appear when the conditions of water and earth are right. Now, how about that? That's pretty good. I mean, for the 5th century, it's not bad at all. And he realized that as far as the science of that time was concerned, that there was no way of substantiating that. And he said, but look, we don't even understand how ordinary seeds germinate. So don't be too surprised. And he says it will require a different level of knowledge. We now can see how the possibilities of all that would come later were contained from the evolutionary standpoint within that first creation. That insight, you see, has filled out a hole in traditional theology because it makes it possible to see something that Augustine hinted at and groped for, namely that a creator of our universe would in fact place within it from the beginning, as he put it, the seeds of all that would come later. Why not make a universe within which all of this would come to be naturally? Well, that's a harder thing to do. The easier way would be to pop them in. But if you want a universe within which all of this will happen naturally, that's a tough call. That's a real challenge, and that's the kind of creator we have.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense from a religious point of view, but that assumes you're starting with the certainty that God exists.
Oh, yes.
Because if you just look at what science has done in filling in the holes, some would say it's filled in all the holes, so you don't need the religion in the first place.
Of course, that's not the case. There are several ways of answering that. One is to point out that it has not and cannot fill in why physics should have a subject to begin with. What is the precondition for there being a physics, and therefore for there being a physicist? That there should be a universe in the first place. The universe is such that it asks for an answer to the question why there should be a universe in the first place. But once you have that, once you allow that question to be asked, and you allow the Creator, a being of some kind, responsible for there being a universe, then in fact the rest of it follows. The theologians of 1,000 years ago had to suppose a God who is limited by having to, as it were, do it in sequence. The theologians of today, thanks to the ministrations of the physicist, can in fact fill out a universe such that it is worthy of a transcendent Creator.
Ernan begins with existence. Why is there a universe in the first place? How do the laws of physics happen to be? Existence questions. He then answers his existence questions by invoking God, rooting his arguments in his faith. To Ernan, a God informed by science is a greater God. Science fills in the holes or gaps which theologians could not, such that the universe is shown worthy of a transcendent Creator. To me, my faith is wanting. So although I too begin with existence, I cannot come immediately to God. Other possibilities abound. That's why I go to MIT, to meet Nobel laureate Frank Wilczek. Frank finds deep meaning in physics, not in God.
Frank, how can you think about what science can say legitimately about the possibility of the existence of God?
The first thing that science says is that many of the traditional ideas about God, about how God acts in the world, are definitely wrong. They're naive. And I won't belabor that. Another thing you learn from science is that the ancient texts, which are the basis of most of the traditional religions, don't do justice to what we know about the universe now. They, with rare exceptions, don't have a notion of that the universe could be enormously large, much less that it can contain extravagant numbers of dimensions in quantum mechanics, and or that it's so very old, or most of all, I think, most profoundly, that it's so comprehensible that it can be understood in terms of precise mathematical laws.
Some scientists, philosophers, certainly theologians today, who are apologists or defend a religious position, would claim that just that comprehensibility is evidence that some intelligent outside force, whatever it may be, has so designed the universe so that it could be comprehended.
I think that's a fallacious logic, because it's explaining something that's basic and simple in terms of something that's very complicated. All the examples of intelligence we know about, humans or computers, are very complicated objects, and that complication is the basis of their intelligence. So to say that there has to be some intelligence behind what we see begs the question of, well, who made the intelligence? What does it consist of? Having said that, I do think that there's a yearning for transcendence that we all feel as humans. We want to be so part of something that lasts, something bigger. I do think science offers both consolation and also new possibilities in those regards. I think that intelligent life here on Earth, if we don't mess it up, is in its infancy. And I really do feel that humans in their present form are kind of a transitional form. They're sort of half animal and on their way to something beyond what we can easily comprehend or visualize today. The road to get to that next level may very well lie through technology, maybe a matter of self-design, self-modification, either with artificial intelligence or genetic engineering or some combination of the two, will take us to some new level. And if we can feel ourselves as part of that, I think that to me is a form of transcendence that science suggests. I find it inspiring to think that our children or our grandchildren, or in some sense our descendants, will be much more powerful, much more intelligent than we are. So my answer to the question, is there God? I would say, not yet.
Not yet. Nice, Frank. No creator, of course. He rejects notions of God as archaic and naive. But human beings, empowered by science and technology, becoming more and more intelligent and thus more and more powerful, such that in the far future, our far progeny will be God-like, as if God. It's a grand utopian secular vision, the best in a natural universe. I go with Frank. He has evidence. Yet, still I wonder, in spite of evidence, why do I have this gnawing sense of needing more? I cannot explain it, but cannot avoid it. So I talk to top scientists, including some of the few who believe in God. I meet Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, and a committed believer.
I think both scientists and theologians are looking for the truth. Science is a way of knowing. Faith is a way of knowing. They ask different questions. They use different approaches to try to answer those questions. Science is all about the natural world. If you want to understand how things work in the natural world, science is the proven method to get those answers. It is a flawed process because your hypotheses are often wrong. Your data sometimes is misleading. But ultimately, over the course of time, with multiple different points of evidence, you arrive at something that is actually true. Faith, on the other hand, asks different questions that cannot be so approached in such a cut and dried fashion. And I think that's why it makes a lot of scientists uneasy, and they sort of stay away from it, saying, well, someday I'll think about that when I'm in retirement, perhaps. But if you really are interested in truth, you have to say, okay, what are the big questions? Why are we here? Is there a God? What happens after we die? What was there before there was anything? I don't think science can help us answer those questions in any substantive way. So either you decide to ignore those questions and to say, I'm going to define them as irrelevant, which is what some atheists would do, or you have to adopt some approach toward them. Here's why I think that may be a surprise to some people who think that faith and reason are two sides of the coin, or opposites, if you will. Not at all. Reason is part of faith. Reason is part of science. Reason is not the sort of pure province of the scientific mind. There is a rational approach to trying to decide what you believe. But your standards of proof obviously have to be different, and ultimately, I think it has to be said, nobody comes to belief in God by absolute proof, and God did not intend for that to be available to us as a pathway. Otherwise, we all would have come to that conclusion long ago. Part of God's plan was to challenge us to the question of, are you willing to take a chance on this here? I took that leap 27 years ago, and it changed me in ways that I can partly describe and partly cannot.
But if we look at statistics and compare the believers in the scientific community versus the general population, we find the believers in the scientific community significantly less. And then even within that, I think biologists or elite scientists are even lower. So the higher you go, the less the belief is, which seems to be empirical evidence exactly the opposite of what you're saying.
Well, I think there's several reasons for that. And again, because I started from the perspective of atheism, I think I know them particularly well. One really is that the scientific mind is something that is cultivated and developed over the course of a career, and which is not necessarily easily adapted to this different kind of thinking about issues for which there can be no scientific facts that really help you. And it is easy, therefore, as a scientist to begin to just reject as out of hand any of those arguments. I think there is also this sort of herd immunity to religion that comes about for anybody who's in the higher echelons of science, because you just don't talk about it. And when you hear that somebody in the scientific community actually is interested in those things and goes to church regularly, there's this sort of subtle implication that maybe they're a little soft. And maybe less generously, but I think it's in there also, there is an arrogance that comes with science, that my mind is sufficiently developed that I can understand everything there is to understand. So you're being asked as an elite scientist to get into uncomfortable territory with a bunch of people who don't seem to believe things that are obvious as the nose on your face. Why would I want to do that? No wonder that there's only 7% of those elite biologists that call themselves believers. But they're missing out. I'm one of the 7%.
One of whom I am speaking with.
You are indeed, and one who's very happy to have found himself into that category and who can't imagine sort of how narrow life would be without that.
Francis is remarkably open about his belief in God, for which he takes heat from fellow scientists. He focuses on existence and on origins as ultimate arguments for God. I do similar. I call it deep reality and wonder whether it leads to God. But I waver and struggle. I do not feel the confidence of Francis, and I find no comfort of the believer. Yet Francis is a biologist, not a cosmologist, and most cosmologists have other explanations for existence and origins, without a creator and no God. I put the question to cosmologist Paul Davies, who seeks ultimate explanations, deep reality, within the universe, not outside of it.
Then, of course, I found over the years I was working on things like the origin of the universe, the nature of time. The nature of consciousness has always fascinated me. Things which for centuries or millennia have been exclusively the province of priests and philosophers, but I was coming at them from a scientific point of view, along with many of my colleagues. And so inevitably, we were raising again those age-old questions of existence. How did the universe come to exist? How is it going to end? What is the place of human beings in this great scheme of things? Is there a meaning to it all? So it was quite natural to then reapproach this subject of science and theology from the scientific side. It's a matter of science and a matter of observation to determine whether what we call the universe is all there is, and it has an ultimate origin in space and time at the Big Bang, or whether it is a small component in this larger assemblage. It may be tough to determine observationally.
And then the nexus with theology comes whenever you are forced to stop, whether this Big Bang was the origin or you go back an infinite time and you have to evaluate why does this whole thing exist. That's where theology would make it stand, so to speak.
I think there's a real issue here about the nature of time, but it has to do with this whole business of origins, because most people, I think in the popular imagination, the problem of science and theology is the problem of how did it all begin? People say, well, you scientists are very clever, but you can't explain what made the Big Bang, or what happened before the Big Bang, as if that somehow undermines the whole scientific agenda. And the implication is, well, God made the Big Bang go bang. But actually it's very bad theology, the idea that there is a pre-existing sort of cosmic magician who is there within time for all eternity, and at some particular moment thinks, oh, I'll make a universe, and then presses a button and bang, there's the universe. I think that's an idea that serious theologians abandoned a long time ago. But most people don't understand that. Most people think that the universe could not come into existence at some particular moment without having a causative agent, somebody or something there before it to make it happen. But Einstein told us that time, like space, is part of physical reality, and the origin of the universe, the ultimate origin, would involve the origin of space and time as well as matter and energy. And so we can't really use the normal terms of causation. We can't talk about what happened before the Big Bang in that picture, because the Big Bang is the origin of time. And so you have to go to a more sophisticated position and say, well, we can imagine that there might be something like a God or a creator who is outside of time altogether, as in classical Christian theology. But now we're talking not about causation in the usual sense, but about explanation. Why is there a universe? Why does it have the laws that it does at all times? And so we're thinking about something which is timeless, which is underpinning physical reality, guaranteeing its lawfulness. That's something that comes quite close, I think, to sophisticated modern theology, but it's a long way from popular religion. And I'm not sure that this entity, which is responsible for keeping the universe in being at all times, really comes very close to the personal God of popular religion.
Paul searches the universe for meaning. This is unusual for a scientist, and I admire him for it. Paul does not find God. I'm not surprised. But he does sense some kind of purpose, something the universe is about. I am surprised. That's progress, I think. But why not more? Scientists can agree on their scientific beliefs. Why not on their meaning beliefs? I keep returning to deep reality and whether meaning and purpose is forever beyond the expanding borders of science. I go to Caltech and ask planetary scientist Bruce Murray.
We are humans, and scientific humans are no different than other humans. They have their own prejudice and shortcomings, and they tend to do, as I do, see things in the context that they're familiar with. Now, for physical science, that's not too bad. When you start talking about things that involve humans, we tend to see things the same way, and that's been a source of a lot of trouble over the years. So I think that the humanity of science and the frailties of us humans is an important concept in evaluating scientific ideas.
How about the way science thinks and the way religion thinks? How would you compare and contrast the two?
Well, religion, in most religions, certainly Western ones, is based on a faith. Faith in a God, faith on a certain revelation, that certain truths, whether they be biblical or otherwise, are true. And that's where you start. It's a faith, it's a belief. It's a convenient one. I happen to share it, but I wouldn't want to defend it in a court of law. Science considers itself free of this, but that's not entirely correct. We try, but we are also human. And so it's hard for us to really scrub our minds free of human anthropomorphic assumptions. And so it's important for scientists themselves, it's important for the general public that deals with scientific evidence and products to realize, hey, we're human, we're just like everybody else, and we can be prejudiced, and we can make errors in judgment, and we can see things incompletely. On the other hand, we do have a technique, which is science itself, which is external to us to some extent. We may not understand the answers properly, but experimental methods, controlled observations, do provide a kind of information that you don't get by just imagining it. You don't get it by reading a sacred text. It comes from nature itself.
But are there boundaries to science? Impenetrable walls beyond which you cannot pass?
I certainly think so. Again, it's not a provable statement. If we knew the answer, we'd have the answer. But I certainly think there's so much in our own consciousness and our feelings, so much more than we realize, and we are so primitive compared to some future system, that it's a little bit naive to suppose we can analyze ourselves, that we can understand ourselves well enough to realize it when it's prejudice and when it's incomplete thinking. I don't think scientists are any less prejudiced about the world they live in. I don't think they have more noble values than the rest of us. I don't think they're special. And so scientists, despite their expert knowledge on the material world, have no special insight that I'm aware of into what you might call the spiritual world. That is still a mystery, particularly the big questions. Why does things that are to us seemingly evil flourish and good things not? Those questions go back to Job. They're old, they're not new, but we don't have any better answers for them.
So Job or our best scientists, you put them at the same level?
On that question, yes.
About science and theology, what can we know for sure? Only this. Super smart people line up on each side of the deep reality debate. Arguments honed, emotions high. Some say science and theology complement each other and enrich understanding. Others, that theology is nonsense and corrupting and must not besmirch science. Science and theology are not symmetrical. No one disputes the discoveries of science, whereas theology is a boiling cauldron of claims and counterclaims. Along with those who critique religion, I usually find myself nodding in agreement. But when they conclude that there is nothing non-physical, nothing spiritual, no God, I hesitate, then halt. What's stopping me from going all the way with atheism? Deep reality. Deep reality. Deep reality is closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.